What's up guys, Xbox Tech Jackie back today with another video. Today we're going to finally be talking about Halo Primordium, the second book in the Forerunner saga, written by the late and great Greg Bear. This book came out just 1 year prior to Halo 4 in 2011, so it again talks about the Forerunners, their origin, not really their origin so to speak, but pretty much kind of like what happened at the very end of the Forerunner Empire, and kind of what led to the events that started off Halo to begin with. So let's just jump right into it. In Halo Cryptum, we follow Born Stellar, but in this book we decided we're going to follow Chakis, who was Born Stellar's human companion. This book basically starts off right from the moment that Chakis is captured by the Master Builder and sent away. It starts with Chakis falling from the sky, not really realizing where he is or what's happening. All he does know is that once he does hit the ground of this planet, he is completely injured, the armor that he was gifted by the Didact is damaged, and he is found by a young human girl. This young human girl brings him back to her village where she nurses him back to health. Pretty much all the humans in this village want nothing to do with him, want her to get rid of him. They already think she's kind of odd, mostly because of her closest relative, a man known as Gamelpar. As soon as Chakis is back to health, he follows her outside of this little hut that they have been living in, and come to find out he is on a Forerunner ring world, also known as Halo. Now, when Chakis decides to confront Venevra, as we come to find out that is her name, the girl who nursed him back to health, he addresses her about what exactly is going on, where he is, and all this kind of stuff. She doesn't really know all the answers, but she does know a person who will, which is again her relative Gamelpar. She takes him to him because Gamelpar is kind of almost the only human on the ring world that knows anything about Heir to Tyrene, aka Earth. Upon meeting Gamelpar, it is soon discovered, or at least revealed to us, that he has within him a Gesh. Again, a Gesh is kind of like an imprint of a past life onto a newborn human. So for example, we do know that Chakis has, the Lord of Admirals as his Gesh. It's something that's kind of like having another person living inside you, but they can't control you, they can't take over, they can simply just talk to you inside your head, which kind of sounds a little obnoxious, but what are you gonna do about it? One of the biggest problems for Chakis is that he doesn't have his other companion. He doesn't have Rythaze. And Rythaze, again, is a very important person to him. They've been close for so long. And so with this knowledge, he pretty much determines he's going to go out and try and find Rythaze on this planet. And these two humans that he had just met on the planet, or on the ring, decide that they're going to go with him and try to discover, why he's here, everything going on, because there's a lot of stuff happening on the ring that hasn't been revealed to us, but is becoming very obvious to the humans living on this planet. One thing I really want to mention about Halo Primordium is it is a very, very lore-heavy book. This is probably one of the thickest books, not in the terms of actual page numbers, but in the amount of lore that is just within this one book. And it's so hard to try and focus on every single detail. So I'm going to try to do my best to really just summarize most of the story and really get into talking about the end of the book, because I think the end of the book has a lot of really bigger implications for the Halo universe that still to this day aren't fully answered, and it's really important stuff. So we're going to jump into that all, but first let's really talk about the entire journey of this book. As the trio are making their way across the ring world, they're noticing a lot of different things. One, there are countless areas where they found dead Forerunners, which is kind of curious because, this is a Forerunner world, so how exactly are there so many dead Forerunners? Not to mention that there are pieces of the ring world that are constantly being ejected from the surface. Think back on Halo Wars 2 if you've played it, where Professor Anderson pretty much ejects a piece of the newly minted Installation 09. It's exactly like that. Now, one other thing that's kind of curious is through the book, it mentions it but doesn't make a big deal about it, is that there's a small planet in the distance in the sky that is slowly but surely getting closer. That planet has a really big, important implication for the later story. We'll get into that momentarily. Now, what's interesting is at one point during their journey, we come to find out that Venevra has essentially within her this beacon of sorts. And we discover that pretty much every human native to the Halo ring world has this beacon within them that essentially leads them to a location that's supposed to be a safe place. So the crew decides to follow her because she keeps saying we gotta go this way, we gotta go this way, this is important. And so they decide, okay, that makes sense, let's follow you. But what this ends up leading to is quite terrifying. We discovered that one of the locations, and there's multiple of these, ends up being the Palace of Pain. And the reason it's called the Palace of Pain is because this is where foreigners would take humans to be experimented on with the Flood. And while this is happening, when the trio makes their way to the closest Palace of Pain, what they see is a mass of humans being herded into the Palace of Pain, along with Forerunner war sphinxes kind of like guarding them, making sure none of them like run off. But likewise, hovering over them is the Primordial. Now, if you don't recall, the Primordial is essentially the last precursor, or at least that's what he reveals to Bornstellar at the end of Halo Cryptum. Again, the precursors were the original species that came to the Milky Way galaxy. They planted the seeds of life, they made the foreigners, they made the humans, they made the mantle of responsibility. And they were the ones who said, yes, foreigners shall be the keepers and protectors of the mantle, and yada yada. Which we obviously discover and know at this point that the foreigners found out that, basically the precursors were going to choose humanity instead, and that made them really mad, caused a civil war, causing them to essentially attack the precursors, and one thing led to another. We now have the Primordial, who is kind of like a mutated version of a precursor, so think of him more as half precursor, half Gravemind. Now, obviously, the wise thing to do in this situation is to not go anywhere near the Palace of Pain or the Primordial, because that would just be the most foolish thing to do. So essentially what Chakis and Gamelpar have to do is quite literally drag the Nevra away, because there's something within her that's saying you need to go here, and they have to fight it because, again, it's a bad idea. As they finally make their way away from the Palace of Pain, they again discover more things, such as the planet getting closer, more pieces of the ring being ejected or damaged, and more dead foreigners. Now, one of the crazier part about this book is when they come across like this group of forerunners and humans and like other subspecies of humans, and what's interesting about this is it's kind of like the first time while their journey that they've discovered like other people that like will invite them in, make them feel safe, and it almost feels too good to be true, which it ends up being, because the main forerunner who's been kind of like leading this group is a person known as Ganymede. And we come to find out that 80% of what we've seen, the other humans, the Forerunner, but not the subspecies or the subspecies of the human, I'm going to butcher this, but it's a thing called a Gigantothepathicus. Her name is Mara. She's probably the only thing that we find out is real. The rest of the people and the Forerunner are actually projections by a Forerunner monitor. This monitor was in fact once Ganymede, but Ganymede decided that he needed to save as many species as possible, so what he decided to do was essentially compose them into various monitors, and that's what Ganymede wanted to do with Benevra, Gamelpar, and Chakis. Obviously, the group does not want this at all, and pretty much fight back. However, there's one souring note on this is, at the end of this whole conflict, Gamelpar, not necessarily injured, but just kind of at the end of his life, decides that he's just ready to die. Ganymede kind of begs to allow him to compose him and save essentially his essence, but Gamelpar doesn't want that. He just wants to die in peace. He asks that Chakis takes care of the Nevra, tells her her real name, and that's kind of important because essentially in this culture is by knowing a woman's real name, you're essentially becoming a companion to her. So it's almost like Gamelpar's giving him you can be with her, even though Chakis never really kind of says, well, I'm trying to be with be with her. So it's kind of a weird moment, but it just needed to be discussed that at one point they were close to being composed and turned into these monitors. Now, quickly after this, we finally run into Rythaze. And now this is important because Rythaze tells about his perspective. Similar to Chakis, he also, woke up while falling to the planet, and his Forerunner captives that were kind of guarding him and Chakis survived, unlike Chakis, who had died upon impact. They kind of make their way across the ring world. However, the biggest difference is that they come across the Flood, and now the Flood quickly infects the two foreigners. But what's kind of interesting is while they have the ability and the chance to, they don't infect Rythaze. And Rythaze is able to escape. He finds Chaikus and his group of friends, but kind of like loosely follows them a little bit before, you know, essentially addressing them, because he senses the danger that was Ganymede. Okay, so that was kind of like the major points of what happened across this journey. What I really want to talk about now is kind of like the last portion of the book, and without trying to get into too much detail because I will sit here and ramble, essentially what happens is this part of the book is a little more caught up with Cryptum. At this point, we know that Mendicant Bias, the Forerunner and Scylla, had, you know, been corrupted by the Primordial, has taken Zeta Halo, or in some cases known as Gyre 11. We don't learn about that particular name until a very later book, which obviously we will discuss in the future. But they have taken control of this ring. They tried attacking the Forerunner home planet, Mathrillian. They were able to pretty much attack pretty much a good portion, causing the Foreigners to abandon all hope. Many of the rings were damaged, and when Zeta Halo was basically under attack, Mendicant Bias took the ring and, you know, went into slip space. The problem though is that when they went into slip space, the ring was already heavily damaged. And as you may know, many of the rings kind of have a, you know, either all else fails type of protocol. Either save itself, which it will jump into slip space and go to somewhere else to stay safe, kind of like how Installation 04 did in Halo Nightfall, or in other cases, to ensure it's not compromised, it will try and essentially destroy itself by getting very much into the trajectory of a planet and, you know, colliding with that planet. This is important because, as I've said, throughout this entire book, there's a small wolf-like planet, the way Chaikus has described it, that is making its way closer and closer to the ring, and that is because this is the planet that the ring has decided it is going to collide with in order to, you know, prevent its capture by the flood as it's, you know, dictated to do. Now, back to our main characters. They were making their way across the ring world once again, but they've kind of reached like a dead end. There's nowhere really to go. They don't really know what else to do, which is interesting because then they come across this Forerunner transport and they decide, well, what else can we do is but to get onto it. Think of it kind of like a gondola, but much quacker, maybe more like a space, not elevator, but like a space train, you know, really fast. Boom, boom. Now, while on this train, they finally get some food, but then they discover that they're not entirely alone within this train. In the next little corridor over, they discover that they're kind of packed in with just different species of infected flood members. And it's quite terrifying because it's like being in a room surrounded with flood and having zero control of what they do or what's going to happen, having zero like weaponry or anything to protect yourselves. Now, there is a AI within this train that kind of updates them on the big events. This ringworld's been missing for the past 43 years after Mendicant Bias took it and, you know, kind of just connected with the Primordial, buddy. They had tried attacking Mathrillian, didn't go so well, the ring got damaged, and now it's trying to destroy itself, as I, you know, recently talked about. One interesting thing though is that at one point when they get off the train is they're kind of all led into like this illusion. Many of them feel like that they're back in their home planets, or at least back in a place of comfort, surrounded by other humans and just feeling calm. It's during this illusion that something starts to happen where they feel like a weird immense amount of pain within their body. Now, quickly after that pain has happened, the illusion cuts off. And now, you know, Chaikus and Rythaze realize that they are kind of like packed into this room like sardines with other humans, all of which were missing chunks from like their backs, just chunks of flesh, my apologies. And the reason why they're missing these chunks is because that's exactly where their Gesh, again, like how Chaikus has the lore of Admirals within him, it's basically ripped out of his body. What we discover is that the reason why these chunks of flesh are missing is because this is where their Geshes once were. Again, the Geshes were like the implants of ancestral humans being placed into a descendant of theirs, and they would just basically live, you know, through their perspective, not really being able to control anything, but being able to give like advice and talk amongst, you know, themselves within that person. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. But either way, these Geshes have been implanted into monitors. And now these monitors, who are also under flood control, essentially use projections of their geshes to convince their counterparts, the humans they were once in, that they need to connect with the silent cartographer. Now remember, the silent cartographer is essentially like the map world of the ring, and it allows them to see all the points of control throughout the ring. Now, each one of these humans that have been captured, having their geshes stripped, are sent through various points throughout the ring to connect with those various control centers. Now, the whole idea of doing that is for them to essentially connect with those control centers to take full control of the ring, because again, the ring is pretty much on its own collision course. No one can get it under control. So they essentially force humans and Forerunner flood hybrids to connect with the ring and try and steer it out of the planet's path. Now this is important because eventually we see that while they're trying to steer the ring, Forerunner ships start coming in out of nowhere. And this is when we're finally reunited with Bornstellar, who at this point looks more and more like the Didact than he does Bornstellar. Bornstellar decides that he, kind of agrees with the Primordial on one thing, and that's that we need to preserve this ring as much as possible. So what they end up doing is trying to direct the ring to have it to where the planet will simply go through it rather than hitting it. And then the idea is to, once it goes through the planet, to pretty much move it out of trajectory so it will never come back into like another gravitational pull and hit it once again. Now, this is all pretty much successful. The ring is saved, though it is heavily damaged because after the the planet goes through the ring center, much of the gravity from the planet, obviously pulls onto the ring and it causes, massive damage. Bornstellar pretty much, charges the other Foreigners that are not hybrids or flood hybrids to start ejecting non-essential pieces of the ring and prepare it for basically reconfiguration back at the lesser arc. Now, one thing that I didn't mention is the moment that they were able to successfully save the ring, Bornstellar is not feeling well. Pretty much the mental and physical strain of being connected to the ring and trying to essentially steer it is too much for his body to take, and he quickly passes out after saving the ring. Eventually he wakes up, he discovers that, they were able to successfully take the geshes back out of the monitors and put them back into their prospective humans. However, when Bornstellar awakes, he finds that he's not fully himself and something about him feels different. It's here we discover that he has been turned into a Forerunner monitor, and it's simply because his body had taken too much damage to be saved, and this was quite literally the only way for Bornstellar to save him. Now, Chaikas obviously confronts Bornstellar about this, but it's so hard to connect with Bornstellar because, Bornstellar really isn't him anymore. He is the Didact. And, Chaikas asks about the whole thing, and Bornstellar essentially states that, the life of Bornstellar, his actual life, is more of a memory than it is, his life. He doesn't... It's kind of like when you grow older and you think back on, your younger self, and, that felt like such a different person. That's exactly how it is for Bornstellar, because now he's essentially assumed the life of the Didact and has become, his own Didact, the Isodidact. Now, one of the last major sections of this entire book is probably one of my favorites because it is a conversation between Bornstellar, Chaikas, and the Primordial. So during the events of saving the ring, they were able to safely capture the Primordial and place him within a time lock. Before they actually were going to use the time lock on him, they decided that they were going to interrogate him and try to figure out as much as possible, because up until this point, not many humans had been infected. And in fact, that's what we saw earlier with Rythaze, is that the two Foreigners were infected, but humanity was not. This led many Foreigners to believe that, hey, humans are immune. That means there's a cure and we need to discover it, which is why they were using humans as the testing field on the Palace of Pains to try and figure out what the cure is. And so confronting the Primordial is one of the creepiest moments in the entire franchise because it describes his body on page 360. I'm going to show a picture of it right here. This is done by an artist whose name I will throw up somewhere on the screen. There have also been multiple modern day renders of it as well, but these are just some of my favorite pictures of the Primordial based off the description in the book. Each one is unsettling as the last, and it just goes to show the immense like terror that is the Primordial. Now, the Primordial essentially reveals to Bornstellar that the Flood was created as sort of like a punishment for Forerunners. This is because the Forerunners were the ones that rised up against the Precursors, attacked them because of their arrogance and their defiance of wanting to stay like the top dog, essentially. And it's here that the Primordial reveals to Bornstellar that there is no such thing as immunity or a cure. The only reason that the Flood hasn't infected humanity is simply because they've chosen not to. And it's not for any specific moment or reason. It's essentially just to show, like, to give the Forerunners hope and then take it away. Because think about it, if you're watching, like, humanity not get punished, it's kind of like, oh, okay, so there is a cure. And maybe at the start of it, it was mostly because the Flood didn't really care about humanity as much. It's not because of that. It's simply because they wanted to give the Foreigners that type of hope of trying to find a cure, only for it to be immediately pulled away. Now, one thing that I really enjoyed is when everything's happening, Bornstellar asks the Primordial, like, how are you able to control all of the Flood, essentially, if you are stuck here? How are you able to even experience any of this if you are here? And he essentially also says, like, you are the last of your kind. Like, what is going on? And it's here that the Primordial essentially says, I am the last of this kind, meaning the Precursor. He is, in fact, the last Precursor, but he's not fully a Precursor. He's a Flood Precursor. Sort of like when a Flood infects a human or an elite. You know, they're basically hybrids. They're half human, half Flood. And as we know from everything is, the Flood is a Gravemind. It is all one big brain. And so the Primordial reveals that you can kill the Precursor body. It doesn't change anything. I will simply just be in another body elsewhere. Okay, you're just going to kill one tiny brain in the grand scheme of a billion different brains. And that's kind of terrifying to think, because if the Primordial was the original Gravemind, it essentially means the Precursors live through the Flood. And it is one of the most insane realizations in all of Halo lore, is that every Gravemind you see again is always the culmination of whatever it infects, but it all started with the Precursors. Bornstellar decides that he is going to activate the time lock, and essentially what it does is it accelerates time around the Primordial until it just dies and it turns into dust and just completely disappears. But again, it doesn't do anything realistically, because all it does is kill one body when there's still billions out there. And it's kind of here that, you know, the story pretty much ends. And what we've kind of discovered throughout this entire book is kind of like how in the first book it was through Bornstellar's perspective of him telling the story. This one was through 343 Guilty Spark, who ends up being the monitor that Chakos becomes. And it's here that we revealed that 343 Guilty Spark at the end of Halo 3 has lived because he has been essentially pieces of the monitor have been discovered by this ship known as the Rubicon, and these Oni scientists have been essentially interrogating it, trying to figure stuff out, and they use this information as part of a grander story that we'll get to in a later book. But it's pretty much here that 343 Guilty Spark, aka Chakos, is able to come back to life, and he takes control of the Rubicon and tells the inhabitants on the Rubicon that he's taking them to help him find the librarian who is still alive. And that's pretty much how Halo Primordium ends. Now, as I said, this was a big book, and this might be the longest video I've done for this series. It might be the longest video I'll ever do for this series, because it's just, there's so much to talk about in this one book. But this is such an important book for many threads within the Halo universe, and it's something that as a kid, when I first read this book, none of it made sense to me, and it's still, some of it doesn't make sense to me as an adult. But I hope I did my best trying to convey it clearly as much as possible, and I hope you enjoyed the video. The next book we'll get into is going to be the last book in the Forerunner saga, known as Halo Silentium. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.